The first thing people said they noticed was the smell. Not rot exactly, not smoke alone. Something thicker, greasier. It clung to the trees long after the fire died, seeped into bark and soil, settled into the lungs. Bones cracked in the flames behind the house, while someone inside was still screaming, though by the time neighbors reached the ridge, the sound had already been swallowed by the hills. What remained was heat, ash, and a structure collapsing inward like a body folding around a secret too old to keep. They would later swear they saw shapes moving in the firelight. Too many shadows for one family. Limbs bending the wrong way. Faces pressed briefly into smoke before dissolving. Someone claimed they heard a child laughing while the roof caved in. Another said it wasn't laughter at all, but recognition. Long before that night, before the fire and the bones and the silence that followed, the land had already been warning them. This part of Virginia didn't show up cleanly on maps. Ink faded here, names changed, census lines blurred, families appeared, disappeared, then reappeared generations later with the same eyes, the same crooked mouths, the same unplaceable wrongness. Church records stopped mid-page. Gravestones listed births and deaths that overlapped in ways that made no sense. People learned not to ask. The house sat at the edge of a hollow where fog settled like breath against cold glass. Children avoided the path that led past it. Animals refused to graze nearby. Even the wind seemed to slow as it passed, as if listening. Inside, generations slept under the same roof, shared the same beds, carried the same blood forward, without ever letting it thin. The walls absorbed everything, whispers, prayers, confessions that never left the room. If you're listening to this now, take a moment. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Stories like this travel strangely. They stretch across years and borders, finding people awake when they shouldn't be, listening in the dark. The family called themselves Old Stock. Appalachian blood, God-fearing, land-bound, untouched by outsiders. That was the story they told. What they didn't say was how often the blood circled back on itself, how fathers became brothers, how mothers carried children who would later call them wife, how the family tree didn't branch so much as knot. It started quietly, as these things always do. One child born too small, another who didn't speak until far too late, then spoke with words that felt borrowed, eyes that didn't blink when spoken to, skin that bruised at a touch. The town midwife crossed herself and said nothing. The preacher visited once and never returned. By the time anyone thought to intervene, the house was already full of voices that sounded the same, aging at different speeds, remembering things they shouldn't have lived long enough to see. And in the center of it all, a child was growing, not raised so much as shaped, watched too closely, taught too much, loved in ways that bent the word beyond recognition. By the time the hollow began to whisper his name, it was already too late to pretend this was just another poor mountain family rotting in isolation. The fire would come later, the bones would speak later, but the damage was already complete. The hollow lay in a stretch of western Virginia that surveyors never quite agreed on. Early maps marked it with uneven lines, as if the hand drawing them had trembled. Some labeled it farmland, others left it blank. Locals used older names borrowed from languages no one spoke anymore, words that translated loosely to things like folded earth, or place that keeps what it takes. By the time the county courthouse burned in 1912, most official records that mentioned the area were reduced to ash, and what survived was fragmented enough to be dismissed as error. In the late 19th century, a single road cut through the hills, little more than packed dirt and wagon scars. It connected the hollow to a town that barely deserved the name. One church, one general store, a cemetery that filled faster than it should have. Families came and went, but one remained, rooted to the land with a stubbornness that felt less like loyalty and more like necessity. They didn't farm much. The soil resisted it. They hunted, trapped, and bartered, always keeping to themselves. Old tax ledgers list the same surname again and again, passed from father to son, sometimes skipping a generation, sometimes doubling back. Marriages were recorded, but rarely with outsiders. When they were, the spouse often died within a few years, buried on the edge of the property without ceremony. After a while, the town stopped noticing. Isolation had a way of dulling curiosity. By the early 1900s, the house had expanded in strange ways. Rooms added where they didn't seem to fit, hallways that ended abruptly, staircases that led to locked doors no one but the family used. Children born there learned the layout by instinct, navigating it in the dark, avoiding certain corners without being told why. Visitors reported feeling watched even when alone, the sense of eyes behind walls, behind floors, behind their own thoughts. Church elders made notes in private journals, never spoken aloud, mentions of improper relations, unclean bonds. One entry, dated 1907, simply read, "The blood has turned inward." No action followed. The family tithed. They attended on holidays. They knew where too many bodies were buried, metaphorically and otherwise. It was during this period that the child arrived. No announcement, no baptism, no official birth record. He simply appeared, carried by a woman who looked both too young and far too old to be his mother. Some said she was his sister, others said she was his aunt. A few whispered something worse, then lowered their voices even further, as if the hills themselves might hear. The child did not cry much. He watched. He learned faces before names. By the time he could walk, he knew which doors not to open and which people not to touch. He slept in a bed that had belonged to others before him, stained and reinforced, positioned against an interior wall with no windows. At night, neighbors reported seeing lights moving through the house in patterns that suggested ritual rather than routine. Something ancient was repeating itself there, not because anyone planned it, but because no one knew how to stop. The hollow had become a closed system, feeding on itself, preserving bloodlines the way meat is preserved in smoke. And the child, growing quietly at its center, was not just a result of that system. He was its continuation. From the beginning, the child behaved as though time pressed on him differently. He walked early, but with an unsteady gait, his joints bending just a fraction too far back. His speech came late, and when it did, it emerged fully formed, sentences shaped by an accent no one in the town could quite place. He used words his mother never taught him, names no one remembered speaking aloud. Once, while standing in the churchyard, he pointed at a crumbling stone and recited the name carved there, then added the year of death that had been lost to. Erosion. The preacher watched from a distance and said nothing. At home, the rules were inconsistent, shifting depending on who held authority that day. Discipline came from many directions, affection too. Lines blurred. Beds were shared long after they should have been. The child learned early that closeness was dangerous and withdrawal was punished. Touch meant control, silence meant survival. He adapted by becoming very still, very observant, filing away every detail. Animals avoided him, dogs growled low in their throats when he passed, chickens stopped laying. A goat was found one morning with its neck twisted, bones exposed cleanly, as if someone had practiced. The family blamed predators. No one believed them, but no one challenged them either. In places like this, belief was less important than distance. He drew constantly, charcoal scavenged from the hearth, scraps of paper pulled from old ledgers. The drawings were layered, frantic, pages filled edge to edge with figures that seemed to be folding into one another. Faces with the same eyes repeated again and again, connected by lines that looped back on themselves. When a schoolteacher, briefly assigned to the area, asked him to explain one, he looked up and said, "That's how we stay. Nights in the hollow were loud if you knew how to listen. The wind carried more than weather. Screams traveled strangely, stretched thin by distance, sometimes sounding like laughter, sometimes like prayer. Neighbors woke to the sound of chanting drifting through the trees, low and rhythmic, stopping abruptly when lights came on. The child was often seen outside after dark, barefoot even in winter, standing at the edge of the tree line as if waiting for something to return. As he grew older, his body failed to keep pace with his mind. He learned adult tasks quickly, hunting, skinning, cutting meat along the joints with unsettling precision. But his spine curved. His teeth came in crooked and crowded. One eye drifted slightly inward, giving him the appearance of always looking at something just beyond the person he faced. The family explained it away as mountain sickness, bad water, God's will. Inside the house, roles continued to shift in ways outsiders could not track. A woman listed as his mother in one church note appeared later as his wife in another. A man recorded as his uncle shared a bed with both. The child grew into this confusion without resistance, absorbing it as normal. By adolescence, he was participating in rituals that predated him, actions repeated so often they had lost any original meaning. Blood was shared. Names were spoken over candlelight. Family stories were retold with details added that no one remembered living through. The hollow watched. The town felt it tightening, like a knot being pulled too far. People began to avoid the road entirely, taking longer routes rather than past the property. And still, nothing was done. The child was no longer just a curiosity or a warning. He was becoming a vessel, carrying the weight of generations that refused to end. Something had to break. The land had tolerated enough. The breaking did not come all at once. It crept in through small ruptures, moments that felt wrong even by the hollow's standards. A neighbor's calf was found skinned and arranged beside the creek, organs placed carefully on flat stones as if catalogued. Symbols appeared on trees near the property line, carved deep enough to scar the wood permanently. No one could agree whether they were letters, numbers, or something older, something meant to be read by blood rather than eyes. The child, no longer really a child, began disappearing for hours at a time. He returned smelling of iron and smoke, his hands raw, his nails split. When asked where he had been, he answered with places that no longer existed. Names of homesteads that had burned decades earlier, hollows filled in by landslides, graves that had never been marked. He spoke of them as though he'd just come from there, as though time folded inward around him when he stepped off the path. Inside the house, the rituals intensified. Candles burned through the night. Meat was cured in quantities that didn't match the number of animals seen. The same prayers were spoken backward, then forward again, as if correcting an error. Family members aged at different rates. One woman's hair turned white in a single winter. A man no older than 30 began to stoop and shake, his hands trembling like someone 3 times his age. The child's drawings changed. The looping family figures gave way to something more structured. Houses stacked on houses, rooms inside rooms, a central shape repeated again and again, sometimes labeled with names, sometimes left blank. When a visiting cousin, one of the few outsiders allowed inside, asked what it was, the child replied, "That's where it ends." Screams became harder to ignore, not loud but persistent. Short, sharp sounds that cut off too quickly. Animals vanished. Then people did. A teenage girl from the nearby town, last seen walking the road at dusk, was never found. Search parties avoided the hollow without needing to be told. They circled it like a wound. Rumors spread of a man seen standing on the roof at night, arms outstretched, speaking to the dark. Others claimed they saw the child sitting in the dirt, surrounded by bones arranged in spirals, humming under his breath. The sheriff made a single visit, stayed less than 10 minutes, and left pale and sweating. No report was filed. What frightened the town most was not the violence, but the order of it. Nothing felt random. Everything seemed deliberate, rehearsed, as though the family had been preparing for something, refining it over generations, and now the final version was unfolding. The child was no longer reacting to the house or the hollow, he was directing it. By the time the first fire started, people were already bracing for something worse. It began in the outbuildings, flames licking up old wood too fast to be accidental. The family did not call for help. They stood and watched. The child smiled, just briefly, as if recognizing a signal. Over the following weeks, smaller fires followed. Fences, sheds. Then part of the house itself, quickly smothered, repaired, changed. Church elders met in secret. They spoke of sin and contamination, of bloodlines that needed to be cut, of names that should be erased. Someone suggested burning the place to the ground. Someone else suggested letting the hills handle it. In the end, they did nothing. Fear has a way of masquerading as patience. The night everything ended arrived without warning. No storm, no moon, just a stillness so complete it pressed against the ears. When the fire finally took the it burned hotter than anyone expected. Bones cracked, walls collapsed inward. and from somewhere inside, beneath the roar, came a sound that could not be mistaken for pain. It sounded like relief. When the flames finally died down, the hollow refused to give up its dead. The house collapsed into itself, beams folding like broken ribs, the foundation sinking into the softened earth as though the land was swallowing it whole. By morning, nothing remained but a blackened depression in the soil and a scatter of stones too heavy to burn. No bodies were recovered, no remains identified. The fire had been thorough, in a way fires rarely are. People gathered at a distance, standing among the trees, counting what was missing rather than what remained. Every member of the family was gone, so was the child. No footprints led away from the site, no wagon tracks, no blood trails. It was as if the hollow had inhaled and closed its mouth. In the days that followed, the town tried to restore order through destruction. Animals from the property were shot and buried in unmarked pits. The well was filled with lime and stones. Trees bearing the carved symbols were cut down and burned. Church records were amended quietly, names crossed out, marriages voided, births relabeled as stillborn or misrecorded. What could not be erased was sealed away, locked in filing cabinets no one opened again. At the center of it all was the unspoken truth the town refused to shape into words. The child's parents had not been a single pair. They had been many, overlapping, repeating. Mother and son, brother and sister, father and daughter. The family tree folded inward until it resembled a closed circle rather than a line. The child was not an anomaly. He was the inevitable result of a system that fed on itself for too long. Some said the rituals were an attempt to stabilize the blood, others belie. They were meant to summon something that could live inside such a body. The drawings found later suggested a belief that purity came not from separation, but from repetition. That if the blood never thinned, it might transcend the limits placed on ordinary flesh. The child, malformed and brilliant, fragile and terrifying, was proof that something had worked, though not in the way they'd hoped. The town never held a funeral. There were no prayers for the dead. Instead, there was a collective agreement to forget. Children were warned never to speak of the hollow. Travelers were discouraged from passing near it. When questions arose, they were answered with shrugs and vague references to a family tragedy. Over time, even that explanation wore thin, yet forgetting did not bring peace. Animals refused to cross the old property line. Fires burned strangely in nearby hearths, flaring without cause. Children born in the following years carried familiar features, the same inward-turning eye, the same crooked teeth, the same habit of drawing shapes that looped back on themselves. Some swore they saw movement in the hollow at dusk, a figure standing where the house had been, too tall, too thin, watching the road. Others dreamed of rooms without doors, of voices calling them by names no one had ever spoken aloud. The child had not died in the fire. Of that, the hollow seemed certain. The blood had learned how to move on. The town's reaction came late and without ceremony. There was no meeting announced, no bell rung, no public declaration of guilt or intent. Instead, men arrived at night with shovels and oil lamps, faces set with the kind of resolve that comes only after too much time has been wasted. They went first to the church. Old ledgers were pulled from shelves, pages thumbed through in silence, then carried outside and fed to a barrel fire. Names curled into black. K-ash. Dates vanished. Whole branches of record disappeared in minutes. Next came the schoolhouse, attendance logs, assignment books. A single notebook filled with drawings confiscated years earlier and quietly forgotten in a drawer. It went into the fire too. No one spoke as the pages burned, but more than one man crossed himself when the paper shrieked and twisted, as if resisting. At the edge of the hollow, the last standing structures were torn down by hand. Fences ripped apart, stones from the foundation dragged into the creek. The land was salted in places, though no one admitted to doing it. The goal was simple. Make it unusable, make it forgettable. Make it as though nothing had ever taken root there at all. The church sent for help they didn't name. A traveling preacher arrived weeks later, older than his years, eyes sharp with things he did not explain. He walked the perimeter of the hollow at dawn, muttering prayers that did not match any denomination. He refused to step into the center. When asked why, he said only that some knots were not meant to be untied, only buried. Despite these efforts, the story refused to die. It changed instead, slipping into rumor and half-memory. In some versions, the family had worshipped something beneath the house. In others, the child had been the vessel, not the focus. A few claimed the bloodline had spread long before the fire, carried out through quiet marriages, through children sent away and renamed. Those stories were dismissed most aggressively, which only made them linger longer. Violence followed in smaller, less organized ways. A house 2 miles from the hollow was burned after whispers surfaced about a cousin marrying too close to home. A man was beaten and left in a ditch for refusing to answer questions about his mother's maiden name. Genealogies became dangerous things. People learned to lie about where they came from. The land itself seemed to resist erasure. Crops planted near the old property line failed year after year. Wells tasted wrong. Hunters reported finding bones where no carcasses should have been. Not animal bones, smaller, arranged, always arranged. And beneath it all was the question no one dared to ask aloud. What if the fire hadn't ended it? What if it had only accelerated something already in motion? The child had been the most visible expression of the blood's decay, but he had not been alone. He had been one of many. By the time the town convinced itself it was safe again, the damage was no longer contained to the hollow. It had spread into memory, into families, into the unspoken rules about who you married and how closely you looked at your own reflection. Some legacies don't burn, they wait. Years passed, then decades. Roads were paved. New families arrived with no knowledge of the hollow's history, no instinctive hesitation when passing the stretch of land that locals still avoided without admitting why. The depression where the house had burned filled slowly with leaves and rainwater, becoming just another shadowed dip in the earth. On maps, the property no longer had a name, but the blood remembered. Children born long after the fire began exhibiting the same quiet markers: hyperflexible joints, teeth crowding the mouth, an uncanny memory for names they should never have known. A tendency to speak in loops, returning to the same phrases as if rehearsing something old. Doctors blamed genetics without looking too closely at where those genes had come from. One boy, born 3 towns over, started drawing before he could write. His pictures showed houses layered inside each other, staircases that led nowhere, figures standing hand in hand in circles that never broke. At the center of every page was a hollow shape, left deliberately blank. When his mother asked what it was, he said, "That's where we started." Another child woke screaming from dreams of fire that felt more like memory than imagination. She spoke of chanting she could hear under the ground, of voices correcting each other when they said a name wrong. She insisted she had lived before, that she had been many people, all at once. Her parents stopped asking questions when she began finishing their sentences. The town, now larger and louder, learned to ignore these things. Silence had become tradition. The story survived only in the behavior of the people who lived there, the way they avoided mirrors too late at night, the way they hesitated before tracing their family trees, the way certain surnames were never spoken above a whisper. Sometimes at dusk, a figure could still be seen standing near the old property line. Not solid, not entirely human, just a suggestion of height and shape, watching the road as cars passed without slowing. Those who noticed felt a sudden urge to keep driving, to put distance between themselves and whatever was waiting there. The fire had destroyed the house, it had erased the evidence. But it had not ended the cycle, because the truth the hollow had always held was simple and unforgiving. When blood turns inward long enough, it learns how to survive anything, even extinction. And it never truly lets go.